Dean Martin stumbled onto the stage at the Sands Hotel, drink in hand, slurring his words. The audience laughed. They always laughed. America's favorite drunk was doing what he did best. But here's the thing. That glass in his hand. It wasn't whiskey. It wasn't bourbon. It wasn't even beer. It was apple juice. And Dean Martin was stone cold sober. For 30 years, Dean Martin fooled everyone. The audiences, the critics, the journalists, even some of his closest friends. They all believed he was a lovable drunk who somehow managed to perform flawlessly night after night despite being 3 sheets to the wind. The truth was the exact opposite. Dean Martin was one of the most disciplined performers in show business history. He woke up at 5 a.m. every morning to play golf. He was in bed by 9 p.m. most nights. He rarely touched alcohol, and when he did, it was never before a performance. Never. So why did he pretend to be drunk for his entire career? The answer to that question reveals something profound about Dean Martin. Something that nobody understood at the time. Something that even today most people don't realize. Dean Martin wasn't just a performer. He was a strategist. A genius who figured out exactly how to survive and thrive in an industry that destroyed almost everyone who entered it. And it all started with a simple realization. America loves a drunk. Not a real drunk. Real drunks are sad and pathetic and depressing. But a charming drunk? A drunk who can still sing beautifully, still tell jokes that make you laugh until your sides hurt, still make you feel like you're at the best party in the world. That's not sad. That's entertainment. The drunk act started almost by accident. It was 1950, and Dean was still performing with Jerry Lewis at the 500 Club in Atlantic City. They were the hottest comedy team in America, selling out every show, making more money than either of them had ever dreamed possible. But on this particular night, Dean had a problem. He'd caught a bad cold. His voice was rough, his throat was raw, and his movements were sluggish from the medication he'd taken. He felt like death warmed over. About halfway through the show, Dean missed a cue. He stumbled over his words. He nearly tripped over a microphone cord. Someone in the audience yelled out, "Hey Dean, how many drinks you had tonight?" The room went quiet. Jerry looked nervous. A heckler could kill a show if you didn't handle it right. Dean could have ignored the comment. He could have gotten defensive. Instead, he did something that would change his entire career. He raised his glass, which actually contained water, and slurred. "Not enough, pal. Not nearly enough." The audience went crazy. They absolutely loved it. They thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen. For the rest of the show, Dean played up the drunk angle, stumbling around, slurring his words, pretending he could barely stand. The crowd ate it up. After the show, Jerry pulled Dean aside in the dressing room. His eyes were wide with excitement. "What was that drunk thing you did out there?" Dean shrugged, wiping off his makeup. "Just playing around, covering for the cold." "Well, keep playing around," Jerry said. "That was gold, Dean. Pure gold. I've never seen them laugh that hard." So Dean kept playing around. And over time, the drunk act became his signature. But here's what nobody understood. It wasn't just an act. It wasn't just a gimmick to get laughs. It was a carefully constructed persona, designed to do one very specific thing: make Dean Martin unthreatening. Think about what Dean Martin had by 1960. He was one of the biggest stars in the world. Tall, dark, handsome. A voice like velvet, more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. Beautiful women throwing themselves at him everywhere he went. A best friend named Frank Sinatra, who was the most powerful man in show business. Dean Martin had everything. And that kind of success makes people jealous. It makes people hate you. It makes people want to tear you down just to feel better about themselves. Look at Frank Sinatra. Frank had enemies everywhere. The press hated him. Other performers hated him. Hell, half the people who worked for him hated him. Frank spent his entire life fighting with somebody: the media, the mob, other celebrities, his own family. Frank Sinatra could walk into a room, and half the people would immediately want to destroy him. Dean Martin never had that problem. Nobody hates a drunk. A drunk is harmless. A drunk is funny. A drunk is your buddy at the bar who tells great stories and picks up the tab and never judges you for your own mistakes. You can't be jealous of a drunk because part of you feels sorry for him. You can't hate a drunk because he's too pathetic to hate. Dean figured this out early, and he used it brilliantly. There's a story from 1962 that shows exactly how Dean weaponized his drunk persona. It was a party in Beverly Hills. Big party, lots of important people. Studio executives, movie stars, producers, directors. The kind of party where deals got made and careers got destroyed. Jack Warner was there, head of Warner Brothers, one of the most powerful men in Hollywood. And Jack was doing what Jack always did at parties, being loud and obnoxious, bragging about himself, making sure everyone knew how important he was. He was going on and on about some deal he'd just closed, how he'd screwed over some rival studio, how smart he was, how rich he was, how everyone should be grateful just to be in the same room as Jack Warner. Dean was standing nearby, drink in hand, seemingly barely able to stand up straight. He appeared to be only half listening, swaying slightly, looking like he might pass out at any moment. Then Dean stumbled over to Jack Warner. "Hey, Jack," Dean slurred, putting a hand on Warner's shoulder to steady himself. "That's a great story. Really great. Fascinating stuff." Warner looked annoyed at the interruption. "Thanks, Dean. But I gotta ask you something," Dean continued, his words running together. Warner sighed. "What?" Dean leaned in close, like he was about to share a secret. His voice dropped to a loud whisper that everyone nearby could hear. "If you're so smart, how come I'm the one with the #1 TV show in America, and you're the one kissing my ass trying to get me to do guest appearances on your crappy movies?" The room went dead silent. Jack Warner's face turned bright red. His jaw tightened. You could see him calculating whether to destroy Dean Martin right then and there, and then Dean burst out laughing. He spilled his drink on his own shirt. He nearly fell over. He grabbed Jack Warner in a big bear hug. "I'm just kidding, Jack. I'm just kidding. You know I love you, buddy. You're the best, the absolute best. Come on, let's get another drink." The tension shattered. Everyone laughed. Even Jack Warner laughed, though anyone paying attention could see he didn't think it was funny at all. Dean walked away, having said exactly what he wanted to say, exactly what everyone in the room was thinking. And there were no consequences. Because how can you be mad at a drunk? He didn't mean it. He didn't know what he was saying. He was just being silly, lovable, harmless Dean. Except Dean knew exactly what he was saying. Every single word. Dean used this technique his entire career. He could insult anyone, say anything, cut anyone down to size, and nobody could touch him, because everyone assumed he was too drunk to know what he was doing. There's another story from 1964. Dean was at a dinner party with several prominent businessmen. One of them, a real estate developer who had mob connections, started bragging about how he'd cheated some investors out of millions of dollars. The man was laughing about it, laughing about destroying people's lives, taking their money, leaving them with nothing. And everyone at the table was nodding along, pretending it was funny, because nobody wanted to cross this guy. Dean sat there, seemingly half asleep, his drink in hand. Then the developer turned to Dean. "What do you think, Dino? Pretty smart, huh?" Dean looked up slowly, like he was having trouble focusing. "Yeah," he slurred. "Real smart. You know what else is smart? My dog. He can roll over and play dead, too." The table went silent. The developer's smile disappeared. "What's that supposed to mean?" Dean waved his hand dismissively, nearly knocking over his glass. "Nothing, nothing. I'm just drunk. Ignore me. You keep talking about how you steal money from people. That's fascinating. Really fascinating." He pretended to fall asleep right there at the table. The developer didn't know what to do. He couldn't start a fight with a man who was apparently unconscious. He couldn't take offense at the words of someone who was clearly too intoxicated to know what he was saying. So he just sat there, humiliated, while everyone at the table suddenly remembered urgent appointments they had to get to. Dean had destroyed the man without ever throwing a punch. And everyone would say, "Oh, that's just Dean being drunk. He didn't mean anything by it." Dean meant everything by it. The Dean Martin Show ran on NBC from 1965 to 1974. 9 seasons, one of the most popular shows in television history. At its peak, over 40 million Americans tuned in every Thursday night to watch Dean sing, tell jokes, and stumble around the stage with his signature drink. The production team knew the truth. They had to. You cannot run a hit television show with a host who's actually drunk. The logistics alone would be impossible. The timing, the cues, the camera movements, the interaction with guests, all of it requires precision. A real drunk couldn't do it. Greg Garrison was the director of the Dean Martin Show for all 9 seasons. He watched Dean perform hundreds of times. And years later, he finally talked about what he saw. Dean was the most professional performer I ever worked with, Garrison said. And I've worked with everyone. Sinatra, Sammy, Bob Hope, you name it. Nobody was as consistent as Dean. But what about the drinking? The interviewer asked. Garrison laughed. The drinking was an act. A brilliant act. Dean would come to rehearsal completely sober, completely prepared. He knew every line, every mark, every piece of blocking. Then, about an hour before taping, he'd start getting into character. He'd mess up his hair a little, loosen his tie, start holding that glass. What was in the glass? Apple juice? Garrison said. Cold apple juice. Sometimes ginger ale. Never alcohol. Not once in 9 years did I see Dean drink actual alcohol before a taping. Not once. A camera operator named Eddie Fitzgerald worked on the show for all 9 seasons. He confirmed everything Garrison said and added details of his own. Dean was a perfectionist, Fitzgerald said. I know that sounds crazy, given his whole I don't care attitude. But behind the scenes, he cared more than anyone. He'd go over the script again and again. He'd practice his timing until it was perfect. Then he'd walk out on stage and pretend like he was making it all up as he went along. Fitzgerald remembered one incident in particular that showed him exactly who Dean Martin really was. It was 1968. We were doing a Christmas special. Big show. Lots of guests. Million things that could go wrong. About an hour before taping, I had to bring something to Dean's dressing room. I knocked, and he said, "Come in." He was sitting at his makeup table, going over the script, and he was drinking from that famous glass of his. The one that was always supposed to be full of booze. Fitzgerald hesitated before delivering the next line. I said, "Dean, should you be drinking right before a big show like this?" Dean looked at me, and I swear, for just a second, I saw a completely different person. Sharp, focused, totally sober. Then the mask came back, and he smiled that Dean Martin smile. He handed me the glass. Taste it, Eddie. I took a sip. It was apple juice. Cold apple juice. Not a drop of alcohol. Dean winked at me. I've been drinking apple juice on this show for 3 years, Eddie. But if you tell anyone, I'll have to kill you. Then he laughed, and he was Dean Martin again. The lovable drunk, like the other guy had never been there at all. The apple juice trick wasn't just for television. Dean used it everywhere. In Vegas, at parties, at restaurants, at nightclubs. Wherever Dean Martin went, he had his signature drink in his hand. And wherever he went, people assumed it was whiskey. His second wife, Jean Martin, knew the truth from the beginning of their relationship. She was married to Dean for 24 years and she saw behind the mask every single day. Years after Dean's death, Jean finally talked about it publicly. Dean was not a drinker, she said firmly. I know that's hard for people to believe, but it's true. In all the years we were married, I rarely saw him have more than 1 or 2 drinks. He'd have a beer after golf sometimes, a glass of wine at dinner. That was it. Then why the act? The interviewer asked. John smiled. Because Dean thought it was funny. He thought it was hilarious that everyone bought it. The whole world thought he was this drunk, and he was actually one of the most disciplined men I ever knew. He used to say, "John, they have no idea, and that's exactly how I want it." Jean remembered a specific incident from the early 1970s that perfectly captured Dean's commitment to the character. We were at a party in Hollywood. Big party. Lots of famous people. Dean was doing his usual thing, stumbling around, slurring his words, acting like he could barely stand up. A young actress came up to me. She looked really concerned. She said, "Mrs. Martin, is your husband okay? He seems really drunk. Should we call someone?" Jean tried not to laugh. I just smiled at her and said, "Honey, Dean's fine. Trust me." The actress didn't believe me. "But he can barely stand up," she said. I told her to watch. Right then, Dean was walking past us. He stumbled, nearly fell, and caught himself on a nearby table. The actress gasped, but I had seen something she didn't see. As Dean stumbled, his hand had smoothly picked up his car keys from that table. Keys he'd left there earlier in the evening. The whole stumble was choreographed. He'd done it specifically to grab his keys without breaking character. I pointed this out to the actress. Her jaw dropped. "See?" I said. "He's fine." Dean's commitment to the act was absolute. He never, ever broke character in public. Not once. Not for anyone. There's a famous story from 1966 that became legend in Las Vegas. Dean was doing his regular show at the Sands. Packed house, great energy, everything going smoothly. Then, about halfway through, a heckler in the audience started giving him trouble. "You're drunk," the man yelled. "You're a pathetic drunk. Why don't you sober up and do your job?" The audience tensed. Hecklers were always dangerous. But this one sounded genuinely angry, not joking around. Actually hostile. Dean stopped his song. The band trailed off into silence. The whole room held its breath. Dean turned to face the heckler. He swayed slightly, like he was having trouble staying upright. He squinted into the lights, trying to locate the man who'd yelled. When he spoke, his words were slow and slurred. "Sir, I may be drunk." He paused, taking a sip from his glass. "But tomorrow, I'll be sober." Another pause. The timing was perfect. "And you'll still be an asshole." The audience exploded. They absolutely lost their minds. It was one of the biggest laughs Dean had ever gotten. Security escorted the heckler out while the crowd was still applauding, and Dean launched into his next song without missing a beat. The line became legendary. People quoted it for years. It showed up in movies, on t-shirts, in books about great comebacks. And Dean had delivered it while drinking apple juice. Stone cold sober, but playing drunk so convincingly that even the heckler believed it. But the drunk act wasn't just about avoiding enemies, or handling hecklers, or insulting powerful people without consequences. It was about something deeper. Something that went all the way back to Steubenville, Ohio. Dean Martin was born Dino Paul Crescetti in 1917. His father, Gaetano, was an Italian immigrant who worked as a barber. His mother, Angela, barely spoke English. They were poor, not struggling artist poor, actually poor. Not enough food on the table poor. Dean grew up in a rough neighborhood, surrounded by rough people. He dropped out of high school. He worked in steel mills. He dealt cards in illegal gambling rooms. He did whatever he had to do to survive. He wasn't supposed to be anything. Italian kids from Steubenville didn't become stars. They became factory workers, if they were lucky. They became criminals, if they weren't. They certainly didn't end up on television being watched by 40 million people. But somehow, against all odds, Dino Crescetti became Dean Martin. And Dean never forgot where he came from. That's the thing about success when you come from nothing. It never feels real. It never feels safe. Part of you is always waiting for someone to figure out that you don't belong, that you're a fraud, that you should be sent back to Steubenville where you came from. Dean felt that way his whole life. And the drunk act was his protection. Think about it. If you're a drunk, you're not a threat. Nobody's jealous of a drunk. If you're a drunk, people don't expect too much from you. You're already damaged, already flawed. Nobody's going to come after you, because what's the point? And if you're a drunk, your success seems like an accident, like something that just happened to you, rather than something you worked for, something you deserve. You got lucky. You stumbled into fame the same way you stumble across the stage. Dean Martin could be wildly successful without ever seeming like he was trying to be successful. He could be the biggest star in any room, while everyone there felt a little bit sorry for him. He could have everything, while appearing to deserve nothing. It was genius. And it worked for 30 years. Frank Sinatra was one of the few people who truly understood what Dean was doing. Frank and Dean were best friends for over 40 years. They performed together, partied together, traveled together. Frank had seen Dean behind closed doors more times than he could count, and Frank knew the truth. In 1977, Frank did a rare interview where the subject of Dean came up. The interviewer asked about Dean's legendary drinking. Frank's reaction was immediate. He laughed out loud. "Dean doesn't drink," Frank said. "I mean, he drinks, but not like people think. Not even close." The interviewer looked shocked. "But his whole image is an act," Frank said. "The best act in show business. Dean's been fooling people since the day I met him." Frank leaned back, clearly enjoying himself. "Let me tell you something about Dean Martin. He's the most sober guy I know. I'm serious. He's in bed by 9 o'clock most nights. He wakes up at 5 in the morning to play golf. He doesn't party. He doesn't stay out late. He doesn't do any of the things people think he does." "Then why the drunk act?" the interviewer asked. Frank's smile faded a little. He thought about the question. "Because Dean's smart," Frank finally said. "Smarter than me. Smarter than anyone gives him credit for. He figured out a long time ago that people leave you alone if they think you're drunk. They don't come after you. They don't expect anything from you. They just let you be." Frank paused. Dean, more than anything, just wants to be left alone. So he created this character who's too drunk to bother with. And everyone bought it. "Even you?" the interviewer asked. Frank smiled again. "Even me sometimes. That's how good he is. He'll be sitting right next to me, drinking apple juice, and I'll forget it's not bourbon. He makes it look that real." Dean Martin retired from regular performing in 1991. He was 74 years old. His son Dino had died in a plane crash 4 years earlier, and Dean had never recovered. The joy had gone out of performing. The joy had gone out of everything. By then, his drunk persona was so legendary that most people assumed he had finally given in to alcoholism, that the act had become reality, that Dean Martin was drinking himself to death in his big house in Beverly Hills. The truth was exactly the opposite. Dean spent his final years living quietly. He played golf when he felt up to it. He watched television. He ate dinner at his favorite Italian restaurants. He saw his children and grandchildren when they visited, and he almost never drank. "Dad was a homebody," his daughter Dean said years later. "People think he was out partying every night, drinking and carousing, but the dad I knew was home by 7 o'clock, watching westerns on TV, eating pasta, going to bed early. He'd have a glass of wine with dinner sometimes," she continued. "That was about it. The whole drunk thing, it was a character, like something an actor plays. It wasn't who he really was." Dean Martin died on Christmas morning, 1995. He was 78 years old. The cause of death was respiratory failure. He died sober. At his funeral, the church was packed with legends. Frank Sinatra was there, though he was too devastated to speak. Shirley MacLaine was there. So were hundreds of others who had known Dean over his long career. Shirley gave one of the eulogies. She talked about Dean's talent, his charm, his kindness, his humor, and then she said something that made everyone in the church smile through their tears. "Dean fooled all of us," Shirley said. "For decades we thought we knew him. The drunk, the playboy, the guy who didn't care about anything except the next party and the next drink." She shook her head. "But that wasn't Dean. That was a character he invented. The real Dean Martin was a devoted father, a loyal friend, and the most disciplined performer I ever worked with. He just never wanted anyone to see it." Shirley paused, looking out at the crowd. "I think Dean liked being underestimated," she continued. "He liked people thinking he was just some lucky drunk who accidentally stumbled into success, because as long as they thought that, they never saw him coming. And by the time they figured out how smart he really was, it was too late. He'd already won." The audience laughed. It was exactly what Dean would have wanted. So the next time you watch an old Dean Martin clip, look closely. Watch him stumble across the stage with that glass in his hand. Watch him slur his words. Watch him forget his lines. Watch him act like he can barely stand up straight. And remember, that glass was apple juice. Those stumbles were choreographed. Those forgotten lines were scripted down to the last pause. And Dean Martin, the lovable drunk, the guy who didn't care, the man who made everything look so easy, was the smartest, most disciplined, most calculating performer of his generation. He just never wanted you to know it. That was the real genius of Dean Martin. Not his voice, not his charm, not his timing. His genius was making the whole world believe he was exactly what he wasn't. For 30 years, America watched Dean Martin play a drunk. And for 30 years, Dean Martin watched America fall for it. Stone cold sober, laughing all the way.